how are you? And welcome to another podcast by George. Well, we're back in the office of Dr. Stephan Schmidt at Iowa State University to talk about politics, which really, it's got my head spinning here over the last week or so. And when your head's spinning, you need to go see the doctor. So that's what I wanted to do. Stop in and see Dr. Stephan Schmidt. I want to read a shorter version of his bio this time. We started with the long version on the first episode. A lot of folks are just finding out about him here on Podcast by George anyway. And so I want to read this kind of shorter version, and then eventually we'll just probably start calling him Doc or something. But Dr. Stephan Schmidt's a professor of political science at Iowa State University here in Ames. He's the author of 11 books, including the best-selling college textbook, American Government and Politics Today, which has been read by more than 3 million college students. I'm always blown away by that. I grew up in Colombia, South America. His parents were German immigrants, and his father founded Optica Alemana?
Yes.
Yeah, the largest optical company in Colombia. He studied in Switzerland, France, and graduated from Military Academy in Jacksonville, Florida, and Rollins College, Winter Park, Florida. He obtained his Ph.D. from Columbia University in Public Law and Government. He's the recipient of numerous teaching awards, including the Amico Award for Lifetime Career Achievement in Teaching and the Teacher of the Year Award. And he's a Lucan professor at Political Science here at Iowa State University. As I mentioned, he's known as the Doc, Dr. Politics, to as many readers, followers, friends, and fans worldwide. He's a frequent commentator on national and international news media, including Spain's largest news service, Venezuelan independent newspapers, German news, and Canada's largest cable network, and you've probably heard of CTV. Now, he analyzes politics for CNN, Telemundo, and Univision. He's the guest every week on a couple of radio shows, Clear Channel, our friends out at WNHN in Concord, New Hampshire, also have him on. I really like this. He's a founding member of Iowa State University's U.S. Strategic Command Academic Alliance, author of 2 books on identity theft, so he's diversified, and he's a frequent speaker on cyber threats to business, critical infrastructure, and the U.S. government. Okay, so we've laid the groundwork here for the doctor's bona fides, which are not in question. I just got to ask you, I mean, my head's spinning here. Everybody's talking today again about the Mueller investigation. Doc, where are we headed on that? What do you think is going to become of Mueller's report?
Well, you've got, obviously, the Republicans and President Trump who are saying we're never going to release the Mueller report. You've got the summary of it. We'll give you a longer summary, and we'll have basically redacted out with black lines some of the confidential stuff. But the whole report just can't be released because it's got all kinds of security things in it. And the Democrats insist on having the whole package, including all the grand jury testimony and every single footnote and scrap of it. I'm guessing we'll get something in between those two, that there'll be more than the 4-page report that the Attorney General released, which is in doubt by a lot of people because the Mueller report itself apparently really doesn't exonerate Donald Trump. It just, we don't know exactly what it does. And so there's still a question about it. And we're coming up to the 2020 elections, and there is great concern that what happened in 2016 with the Russians and social media and poking around and basically pitting Americans against each other, and the WikiLeaks release of a lot of Democratic documents, Hillary Clinton's stuff and the Democratic National Committee stuff, will happen again in 2020. There's real concern about that. So it's important to know a little bit more about what's in that report in terms of what Mueller discovered, in terms of not perhaps collusion, but highly questionable relations between many members of the Trump campaign and a bunch of Russians, and why they were so interested, in making connections with people in that campaign. And it's not going to go away, but I think the American public is probably moving on and wanting to deal with some other issues.
Yeah. Well, just my personal perspective, my background is in journalism. That was the early part of my career. Donald Trump gets elected, and almost before he got elected, people started talking about this Russia connection. And at the time, I thought, Russia? I mean, my God, that sounds like something out of my childhood. I mean, the Russians are coming. I mean, who thought that up? Where did that come from? And so, and that was put forward. And my wife's big Rachel Maddow devotee. Every night we're watching that, and I'm watching it, and she's very detailed, and I can't say that she isn't truthful, but I'm thinking there's a lot of pieces here, but when's the puzzle going to come together? I'm not seeing it.
Yeah.
Furthermore, no dissenting opinion. Nothing on the other side. And I'm looking at this and saying, number one, something needs to become of this. And number two, why doesn't somebody else that has a counter opinion get included on this programming? Watch this for 2 years. The Mueller report summary comes out from Barr, and he quotes a little bit of the report from Mueller saying, there is no Russian collusion. And I'm going, oh, my God. The Democrats, unwittingly, Rachel Maddow at the lead, have just handed the 2020 election to Donald Trump. I'm overstating it, obviously, but that was the first heart attack that I had after that summary came out.
Well, the expectation was so high, right?
Yeah.
That there was going to be a bombshell and a smoking gun and all the rest of the metaphors that you can use about Russian interference. When the seven most important American national security agencies, including the NSA and the FBI and all the rest of the intelligence community, say there was Russian interference in the election, I have to believe that. I just have to trust those agencies. They're there to protect and defend the United States and give us information that is important. Whether the Russian collusion was coordinated with or intended to get Donald Trump elected, there's, I think, an analytical question there. But certainly Trump got elected, the Russians were interfering, and so it becomes a really interesting story. The other thing is, if you start looking at Europe right now, all the elections taking place in Europe, every single country in Europe, Germany, Italy, France, has evidence of Russian interference in their elections. They are very concerned. They are trying to stop the Russians from using Facebook and social media to pit people in their countries against each other. When you start looking at Britain, at the UK, and Brexit, the exit from the European community, they're now discovering that a lot of the public opinion in the UK was stoked by probably Russian interference, because the Russians really would love to break up the European Union. That gives them a smaller adversary if the Europeans are all fighting amongst themselves. So there's no question that Putin, with his KGB background when it was still the Soviet Union, is an incredibly smart manipulator and knows how to break apart his adversaries and weaken them, and therefore gain more influence and importance himself. So that's the bigger picture. Now, was Trump willingly involved, and did he know this was going on, or was it just a coincidence, that he happened to get elected, and we won't know for a while. Eventually we'll find out. You and I may be a little bit old before those documents and all those secret videos that the Russians supposedly took in the hotel room in Moscow.
Well, they're not.
Those are all going to be revealed at some point. Everything always is revealed.
Yeah. Well, I got my fingers and toes crossed, but I don't know. I'm becoming more skeptical all the time, and I'm flashing back now to an interview that I saw just recently with Noam Chomsky, who I know you're familiar with.
Yeah.
And, of course, he's a big critic of this investigation. And the way that he puts it is, okay, so the Russians maybe meddled around on the Internet and did some Facebook silliness and all of this. But if you want to look at interference in American elections, why are you getting in such an uproar about Russia? You want a country you want to look at, maybe Israel, the influence and impact that they have on American elections. Or if you don't want to look at Israel, maybe you've got religious reasons you don't want to look at Israel. How about looking at the United States? How about looking at Citizens United, looking at money, big money, corporate money influencing American elections? He says those things have had much more of an effect, positive or negative, however you want to look at it, on American elections than Russia ever has. Anything to that?
Yeah, that's probably true. I mean, you can take race, and if you want to really get white voters and white nationalists and African Americans and Hispanics to go at each other, You can create some events, which the Russians did. We know that. I mean, we have the information, and said there's going to be a rally at this place, or if you want to stoke it at a mosque and get people to show up and get tensions rising, you can do that. But it's probably true that compared to the divisions that already exist in this country and that Americans try to emphasize, it may not have been as spectacular as, the media reported. But, the media likes sensational stuff and Russian interference and, Russian spy girls making friends with the National Rifle Association.
Yeah.
All this stuff. It's just fantastic stuff for getting ratings. I eat that stuff up, even though a lot of it I'm very skeptical about. So we need to focus on some things that are real issues that immediately require attention. And obviously the border issue is one. President Trump, that's his top priority, is to deal with that border issue and the numbers that are coming from Central America, how to deal with it. The Democrats, interestingly enough, have no specific solution for that border crisis, which I find interesting because if they criticize Trump and his effort to have hard policies to discourage people from coming here, or hard policies in terms of building barriers so that people can't so easily cross into the U.S. without proper documentation. If that's not the right way to go, then what is? And the Democrats haven't come up with anything that I've seen.
Yeah, they do kind of run around that. What I take from it is that they're wanting everybody to just embrace this additional population that's coming into the country, educate them, bring them into the fabric of the country, and we'll all be one together. But
it's a lot of people.
Is that realistic? Yeah,
it may not be realistic. It's a lot of people.
Yeah. I keep always concerned about journalism and its role here in America.
Sure.
And these are pretty dark times, I think. A lot of people tell us that, and I think about Barack Obama, and when people like Donald Trump were first coming on the scene, we were told over and over, Americans are better than that. They're smarter than that. If you give them an opportunity and if you give them the choice, they'll make the wise decision. I don't think that was necessarily true. I don't think it happened that way.
You ask Trump supporters and they'll agree with that.
Yeah.
So, this is the problem. The problem is that we each have an idea of what we would like the, quote, smart voter to choose. And if the voters choose something else, we go, no, they must be dumb. The truth is that, Donald Trump got over 60 million votes. And it's hard to believe that those 60 million people are either dumb or evil. And I know from all the research that political scientists have done, and I've studied almost all of it, Donald Trump did not get support from one specific group of people with, unemployed people living in rural areas and without much of an education and who are angry. He got support from a very, very broad spectrum of American society, including banking and other industries that couldn't bear to think of Hillary Clinton as being president because they knew that the regulations that were already on the banking industry would become much greater if she got elected. And so they may not have liked Donald Trump, and I think most of them thought he was a little too controversial, but they sure did not want Hillary Clinton or the Democrats to be in charge of that. I know people who are in industries that were overregulated, like pharmaceuticals, and who could not stand the idea again of being overregulated. I know people who think that race relations in this country have gone too far, people who think that divorce and gay marriage and LGBTQ rights have exceeded what they can possibly tolerate, and that they don't want their girls going into a bathroom and some guy who is a guy but is basically saying that he feels like a woman coming into the girls' locker room or bathroom. Those issues, had nothing to do with approving of Donald Trump. They had to do specifically with people concerned about a certain issue and wanting to elect Republicans and Donald Trump because they thought that was maybe the lesser evil, or at least that they might get some satisfaction for their particular concerns out of that. And we keep forgetting that. It wasn't really a referendum on Donald Trump. The evangelical voters didn't vote for him because his moral values are, what they preach on Saturday or Sunday.
And they'll tell you that
right?
for sure. Yeah.
No,
yeah.
they what they did is they said that, we don't approve of that, but he will take some positions on issues that are of huge importance to us that the Democrats can never take a position on. And so we're going to vote for him and support him and continue to support him because the Democrats still haven't come up with what we think is an acceptable alternative for our group. And as the field grows, and the field of Democrats every single day grows, and I have to answer questions about who is this I did Canadian cable television just yesterday. They ask you questions about Buttigieg and other people and want to know, is this person, really going to rise to the top and get the nomination? I have no idea. But I think we're almost up to 20 Democrats now. And for those who want to defeat Trump in 2020, maybe that's a way to go, but wow, there's a lot of confusion. The voters have no idea who the Democrats are going to come up with or what policies the Democrats are going to then advocate for, because the Democrats range all the way from left-wing socialists that could become cabinet members in Cuba or Venezuela, all the way to very conservative, traditional Democrats. Joe Biden comes to mind, and somewhere in between. And there are women, and there are a gay candidate. And so the voters, I think, are looking, especially people who are called independent voters. They're the swing vote. The independents come out of the woodwork and they decide, am I going to vote Democrat or Republican? They're looking at all this and going, this could go great or really off the rails. And in November of 2020, I may vote for Trump again because the Democrats have failed to come up with something that meets my expectations. So that's the real problem. Or
they, with the assistance of journalists, I guess, may play whack-a-skeleton to such an extent. And we just saw a little bit of it with Joe Biden. I mean, yes. How are you going to whittle down this field that way? I mean, bring out all the dirt, all the stuff from 20, 30, 40 years ago, the college days, the high school days on all these candidates, because you got to come down from 20 to 1.
And you're not going to like this, journalists need ratings.
Yeah.
Journalism needs, and the reason newspapers are dying is in part because people are reading stuff online and not wanting to have the paper, but also because the traditional, conventional newspapers are so boring.
Mm-hmm.
There's no sensationalism there. There's no zippy stuff, nothing really well written and engaging that you just are dying to read it. It's boring stuff. And the journalism schools, I think, in part are contributing to that. The inverted pyramid, I don't know if your listeners know what the heck that is, but, boy, that is so ancient history. People want something short, exciting, that gets to the point that they understand. And I think journalists either are dying because they're not giving it, or they're going too far the other direction and giving too much of the sensational stuff. The Russians are coming.
Yeah.
Donald Trump and, porn stars and,
right.
Guys by the name of David Pecker, they can't get enough of that.
Yeah, we got a few laughs out of that, yeah.
So journalism is in a tough situation, I think.
It is.
Because people don't really want objective news, although they really do want they want to know what's going on. They want the truth, but they also want it to be entertaining and engaging. The patience of my students is about, 1 centimeter long. And so Donald Trump discovered, and maybe somebody told him, let's do this. Twitter is just perfect. It's short. You can get everything you want in there.
He says he's the Hemingway of Twitter. That's I mean,
Yes.
when he says stuff like that, do you think he's jacking with us, or is he? I mean, is he straight? Is he being truthful? Does he really believe he's the Hemingway of Twitter?
I think most of the time he is jerking everybody around and getting what I would call quotable quotes.
Yeah.
Because you would not have been able to summarize what Donald Trump is if he hadn't said that. And he is, or somebody, I don't think he tweets all the tweets, frankly. I think that Steve Mueller and others in the dark crevices of the White House late at night are cooking up some of this. But it gets out there, and the news media can't stand it and have to report it. So if you want to get 24/7 news on yourself, Twitter is perfect.
That's perfect.
The news media is going to take it and run with it.
Well, we're getting further in here than I thought that I would, and time's slipping away from us. One thing I wanted to get to, though, because you're familiar with this part of the world intimately, Venezuela. I'm looking down there, and it's interesting on a couple of different levels. The first level is the guy that's running Venezuela down there, that's Putin's guy.
Yes, it is.
And the United States is supporting, a lot of people say, an insurgency down there. They want the other guy in.
Yes.
A lot of people look at that and say, well, there's proof positive that there's no collusion between Trump and Russia, because that's a big deal. There's a lot of oil in play, in particular, down there in Venezuela. And if Trump was really in cahoots with Vladimir Putin, he wouldn't be setting up that scenario.
Life is complicated.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, and I lived in Colombia for many years, and Colombia is right next door. I can tell you that almost every Latin American country except Cuba and Nicaragua want to see the current president illegitimately elected with a phony election out of there, because the country is falling apart. The Venezuelans are leaving by the millions, not by the thousands, by the millions. We think we have a border crisis. Colombia has a border crisis like you can't imagine. They're just leaving the country because the government has so mismanaged. I mean, Fidel Castro, we always joke about Castro's economy and how terrible it was in Cuba. But Venezuela probably has achieved the status of the worst run economy in the world, with inflation over 1,000,000%. Imagine that. With no electricity because they haven't maintained their electric grid. Now, no water in many places because without electricity, as we discover in Iowa, if we have a well and we live on a farm and the power goes down, your well isn't going to work because the pump has to have electricity.
No water, you got nothing.
So there you are. And so the United States is certainly interested in the outcome of Venezuela, especially, as you said. The Russians now are there physically. There are at least 100 Russian troops now in Venezuela. There are Russian military airplanes at the airport, the main airport of Venezuela. And so do the countries of the Americas, including the U.S., want to have the Russians develop a base in Venezuela from a balance of power and global power relations? That would be a tremendous risk and a real national security risk. But how do you get rid of Nicolás Maduro, the current president? An ingenious way is to pick the leader of the opposition in the legislature, which is what Mr. Guaido is, and say, well, he really got elected by the majority of the legislature as their speaker of the House, so to speak.
And that was legit.
And that was legit because those elections were fairly okay. And now, actually, there are 50 countries, I haven't counted today, who recognize this opposition leader as the leader they want to deal with and as, in their view, the legitimate head of state of Venezuela. So it's a nasty stalemate, and as usual, the U.S. is right in the middle of it, and who knows how we're going to get sucked into that one. Yeah. Since we're still in the longest war ever to get sucked into in Afghanistan, 17 years or so.
And some people say Afghanistan's about mineral rights. I've heard that before. But how cynical are you When you look at Venezuela, do you buy into the idea that the United States is so intently interested in there? The United States is because they have twice the oil reserves of Saudi Arabia. That's what I've heard. And that it's all about the oil. As a matter of fact, people believe the entire worldview anymore is all about oil.
All about oil. Nah, not really. The Venezuelan oil is crummy. It's crummy oil.
Oh, it's not good quality. It's not that golden crude, whatever.
No, it is not. It's not sweet crude.
Sweet crude. There
this
you go.
one is tar-like, and it takes a huge amount of work to refine it and get it to where it can be used. And really, right now, there's a surplus of oil in the world. We're producing
prices
a lot.
are low. Yeah,
the U.S. has become actually a net exporter of energy. We're finding new oil fields. Colombia, right next door to Venezuela, has enormous oil resources. So maybe there are some interests there that lost their activity in Venezuela as a result of Hugo Chavez and Maduro now becoming the heads of state and basically taking over the oil industry. But it's always a combination of things, to be honest with you. It's always strategic positioning and geopolitics as well as natural resources. And the Chinese are interested in Venezuela as well, partly for oil. So if you've got a lot of oil like that, you're blessed and you're cursed. Mm-hmm. It may be everybody wants to get their fingers into it. Yeah. But the crisis is a crisis of destabilizing a lot of other Latin American countries, frankly, that cannot absorb millions of immigrants from Venezuela and are desperate to stabilize that whole thing. I mean, look at what's happening in the U.S. with, I guess 100,000 refugees or migrants trying to come here this last month, maybe. And we're freaked out, and the president, is shaking up the government to try to figure out a way to stop that. Imagine if it was millions. So it's another one of those flashpoints in the world that forever, and I teach Latin American politics sometimes, the U.S. Marines in Cuba and the Dominican Republic and running around Nicaragua and Panama, taking over the canal. The U.S. has always been very active, trying to position itself globally. And, Venezuela is one place to come along. The Middle East certainly dominates American, concern. And we haven't succeeded. Now we see this week, as we speak, that Libya is beginning to crumble and fall apart. And I'm hearing from friends of mine who are in the State Department that, oh my God, we should have never overthrown Gaddafi because he kept the country glued together. So go figure.
Well, yeah. And the same in Iraq. I mean, nobody liked Saddam Hussein, but he was a guy that kept the worst elements out of there, basically. He was a strong man.
Yes.
And be careful what you wish for.
We got rid of the Shah in Iran, and Jimmy Carter was delighted because now there was going to be liberal democracy in Iran.
How'd that work?
How'd that work out, Jimmy?
Yeah. That's so good. All right, so let's spin it back home now. I want to talk about the state of Iowa, all of that horrific flooding out in the western part of the state. Am I understanding this correctly? There's $1.6 billion of damage, aid requested, federal dollars in play, and the Republicans are saying in the Senate that it's being held up by Bernie Sanders and other Democrats who don't want Iowans to have that federal assistance, which, okay, why would that be? But it has to do with Puerto Rico and has to do with California assistance. It's all tied. What's the deal with that?
No, it's another one of those political wrestling matches, arm wrestling. The Democrats think that Puerto Rico has been neglected, and Puerto Rico is in terrible shape. And of course, Puerto Ricans are American citizens. They're not a state, but they're American citizens. And so there's a kind of a concern that we should be looking after them more. And the Democrats want to increase the amount of aid that goes to Puerto Rico, as well as Iowa and Nebraska and Missouri. And again, in my talk to, the Rotary Club and other groups, it's the politics of disruption and of division. And we are so divided, we are so polarized that they can't get on board for this. Clearly, we need some assistance in western Iowa with what is going to be actually $3 billion, I saw just yesterday. It's probably more. Farms destroyed, towns underwater, wells contaminated, equipment gone.
And grain and storage ruined. Yeah.
Ruined, cattle dead, and the levees washed away because this was such a powerful rush of water coming down various different rivers that just busted up the old levees, which were not very strong to begin with. So then the question is, we have a big deficit. We have a national debt that is growing crazy wild. Do we have enough money left over to build a multi-billion-dollar wall on the Mexican border and increase spending for defense and bail out Iowa farmers and hurricane victims and so on? And the answer is we have to have that, because we have to do a lot of different things, but you can't do it if you start cutting taxes too much, because your revenue is going to shrink. And I think we are on a strange journey to deficit spending and tax cuts. And that, in the end, if you have a friend who uses her credit card or his credit card too much and they think they can pay it off, at some point the chickens come home to roost, as we used to say. And we are, I think, in that difficult position. The idea is you cut taxes and the economy will grow so much that you will get this enormous revenue from cutting taxes. So then you will actually have more taxes coming in, tax revenue. And it's the Laffer curve, which a lot of people are still making fun of because it's kind of a laugh.
Well, we're not seeing
it doesn't
right.
work.
If it was going to work, it should be working right now.
Does not work.
Does not work. Yeah.
And so, we're paralyzed on that, and I feel sorry for folks in the towns and farms and rural areas, because we have to rebuild all the roads and bridges and bail people out.
You know what the scary part of that? There's no flooding rains. Yeah. This was all because of the winter and the snow melt, and I think they had a reservoir problem or whatever. But is this the new normal? Because think if we'd had really torrential, heavy spring rains, which we can get. Think if that happens next year. At the Missouri River out there, I saw like a topographical map one time. I think it was presented by Bill Stowe, who's shout out to him, by the way. He's suffering with cancer and working through that.
Des Moines Water Works.
He shows that western Iowa back in the day basically was a bog.
Yep.
I mean, it was untillable. It was swampy. And the tiling that everybody's put in there is great for they've got the best cornfields in the history of the world, probably. But it's resulted in this situation with the Missouri River that is not going to get any better anytime soon. And this could be something that we're dealing with each and every spring. And my God, if it had rained, what would have happened?
Well, it's true that we don't want to really face the fact that maybe the climate is changing. I don't care if you're a believer that it's all because we're driving cars and burning coal in power plants. There's some evidence that contributes to it. But the climate change certainly is moving things around in terms of where it's drought and where it's overly wet and where there's too much snow. And part of this may be that we're just seeing the climate change. And, people who say, the climate change is a hoax, have you ever looked back at the history of Earth? It's nothing but climate change. It's nothing but, continents floating and drifting apart. And Florida used to be part of southern Africa before the continents separated.
And why do you view this as an attack on your politics? You know, I mean, it's not an attack on republicanism.
No,
it's something that's historical.
Well, and it happened. And I can't use the word here, but stuff happens.
Yeah.
And the climate, where we're sitting right now here in my office at Iowa State, we would be under many, many feet of frozen glacier.
Yeah.
Because this was a glacier.
Right.
So, climate does change. And if it shifts around, then if you're living in a place where that's an advantage, you're happier than heck, because all of a sudden you can grow different crops and things are great. And if you're living in a place where that is a disadvantage, you may be having to relook at what you do. There are a lot of people who are saying that the only way to solve the problem along these rivers is retreat, is that essentially the farms that are underwater now should be bought out and turned back into floodplains and places where the rivers can expand and without damaging anything. But if you're a farmer living on one of those and have inherited it from your family 300 years back, well, not 300, but a few hundred years back.
You want to build a bigger levee.
You want to build a bigger levee. You want the Army Corps of Engineers in there with tremendous equipment building concrete levees, and the federal government pays for them. And, that's the dilemma that political leaders face. So where we're going to go with this, I think we're going to try to patch everything back up again and see if it happens again. But the same is true on the coast, by the way. On the coasts, especially the East Coast, sea levels are rising. Miami has had to put in $1 billion worth of pumps that have to pump out the flooded streets, even when there's no hurricane, because the sea level rise comes up through the, basically groundwater, which is very spongy in Florida. And so what are you going to do? Are you going to armor it, as we call it? I teach a course on coastal zone management, so we call it armoring the coast. And you can build big, huge armored walls to keep the ocean out. And sometimes it works, but it's very expensive. But at some point, you may not be able to do it successfully. And the same may be true of farming. I see the Mississippi is now spilling over as well and flooding properties along there.
Again, because there's no big springtime flooding rains this spring.
Yet,
It's dry, basically.
Just wait until
Very
next
alarming.
week.
My God, yeah. I mean, we can address these things short term, but long term, I don't know why they wouldn't want to spend money on climate change. That's where they've got to address the larger issue, because the short term fixes are going to be very expensive. They're going to be reoccurring. They're going to get worse.
A lot of construction jobs, though.
Oh, yeah, that's true. If you want to call it infrastructure.
There's always a nice bit of sunshine to all these crises.
Every dark cloud. Well,
that's right.
All right, now before we spin out, real quick, political candidates. We're here the day after Eric Swalwell announced he's going to be on the Iowa State campus Thursday. By the way, I'm going to come in there and see. I've interviewed him a couple of times. Interesting guy. He's got an Iowa background. What do you make of his candidacy?
He's very articulate. He sure looks presidential, or gives you confidence of someone who looks you in the eye, seems to be amenable to every question that he's asked. He's willing to try to answer. All I can say to him is get a ticket and get in line, because it's like the deli. I've been at the Stage Deli in New York on Broadway. You got to get a number and stand in line and wait to get your liverwurst sandwich. And if you want to win the Iowa caucuses, you have to outperform the other 19, maybe by today it's 20 or 21, great candidates. And a lot of them are talented, interesting, have raised a ton of money. And so the question is always, how are you going to outshine the others? What is your message and your secret sauce? Yeah. And I'm going to try to go when he's on campus to listen to him and see what the students.
Yeah, maybe I'll see that. So, he's got a couple of things that separate him a little bit. I mean, you got to be really in the weeds to see the difference. But there's a couple of things I know that you. Number one, he's a big fan of FDR's Four Freedoms. Yeah. He reaches clear back to FDR and embraces him. And as you know, the polarization of America that we're dealing with today very well could be FDR to where we're at today. Yeah. Republicans have chapped about FDR since the 20s, 30s. Yeah. So he's an FDR guy. The other thing about it is he's kind of a bulldog. I like that part of it. And he has no fear of the NRA. The NRA and people that own guns, and the Second Amendment is the biggest thing in the world to them. A lot of times they'll look at those people that aren't gun owners and say, well, you just don't get it. Right. And maybe you're a little soft. Right. And maybe you need a man card if you don't have a gun. I mean, you just need to man up and get yourself a weapon. Well, this guy does. He's the son of a police officer. Yeah. I think he owns guns. He goes to the range and practices. Yeah. I mean, so they can't pull the man card on Eric Swalwell when it comes to gun ownership. And he wants common sense gun legislation. And he's not afraid to go right at the NRA because he's got them. He uses them. He knows all about it.
He's looked at the polls.
Yeah.
Because the polls show
majority of Americans,
majority of Americans want good background checks. They don't want people that are potentially a risk. People should safeguard their weapons. You don't want to lock them up. And if you've got young kids, you don't want to do what happened in New Hampshire with this family where the 11-year-old kid got a hold of a gun that was somewhere in the family and shot his parents in the head a couple of days ago. You want to lock them up and only let kids use them if you're under supervision and it's legitimate. Those are common sense things. I don't know why so many are so afraid of the NRA. It is powerful. It has a lot of members, shrinking numbers, by the way.
Yeah, I heard that.
And uses that money to finance ads and campaigns and stuff. But that's not a bad position to take for most people. But on the other hand, a lot of the other Republicans would agree. I'm sorry, the other Democrats would agree on the issue of the NRA.
Right.
So, he may be more articulate and
more experienced. Yeah.
And I'd love to ask, Elizabeth Warren if she owns a firearm.
Exactly.
And if she says.
Well, Tulsi Gabbard's done 2 tours in the Middle East. She's probably carried a weapon.
Yeah, and she owns one right now, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
So in the end, when it comes to these questions that, what separates this candidate from the other one, often it's their talent at communicating with voters. I keep saying this. I taught a class called Political Leadership, and for years we talked about it's your confidence in the individual. Do I think this person can represent what I'm interested in and make this country better? And that often makes a big difference.
Donald Trump.
Well, Donald Trump got that message across, in ways that the news media certainly missed.
Right.
And a lot of Democrats and others said, well, this is a cakewalk. This is great. Hillary Clinton is going to win by a landslide. And then they discovered that people thought because he was a businessman and knew the art of the deal, that Donald Trump was going to go out there and make deals. And so far, not too many.
Yeah.
So maybe he needs to read his own book and see, chapter 6. Yeah. How to actually complete the deal and come out winning.
Right. How to close one.
Yeah. Because on the immigration and other issues, so far it's been highly unsuccessful, really, on that one.
Yeah. Well, that's great. That's going to be our stopping point, I think, and I appreciate it again. And it's great to come in and when the political world's got your head spinning, talk to the doctor, Dr. Stephan Schmidt, here at Iowa State University, the politics guru. And we'll come back and visit him again. Like to do this every month or two anyway, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot to talk about on our next visit. But for right now, that's another podcast. Bye, George.
That corn stood 8 foot tall by the 1st of August one year. Don't stop raining soon. They won't get them anywhere near.